Welcome everyone. You're watching another episode of Conversations with Alanki. Today I will be in conversation with the 30th Prime Minister of Australia. He needs no special introduction. He just concluded a 17-year-old long political journey. So today I'm happy to be in conversation with the former Prime Minister of Australia, Scott Morrison. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Thank you for having this conversation with me. So how do you find Sri Lanka, and why did you choose to visit Sri Lanka?
Well, over a long time, I've had a keen interest, and it was over a decade ago that I first came here. I was actually in opposition back then, and came here also when I was a minister. And Sri Lanka sits in the middle of an incredibly important part of the world, of which Australia's got a keen interest. And there's lots of people-to-people relationships between Australia and Sri Lanka as well, which are wonderful and positive. And I was happy to accept the invitation now that I've stepped out of political life and come back and see some old friends and catch up on where things are at. I mean, it's been an incredibly difficult time for Sri Lanka in the last few years, well, frankly, the last decade. And what has always impressed me is the resilience of the Sri Lankan people. You've had to deal with more than your fair share of trials.
Indeed. You did mention that Sri Lankans have faced tough times. What are your views on the crisis faced by Sri Lankans in the recent years?
What's probably more important is what's necessary now. And I must admit, I'm pretty impressed that where the country was 2 years ago, it's hard to believe it's come as far as it has in this short period of time, and that hasn't come without a lot of difficult choices and challenges and pain as well, I'm sure, for many Sri Lankans right across the country. But to have stabilised your currency and getting inflation under control and getting interest rates down and renegotiating your debts and bringing some stability. I mean, this was the first order of business, and that's largely being achieved. And I have to commend the President for being able to do that in such short order. There was clearly an environment of urgency, but that does not make the task any less. And things could have been very different right now, and they're in a much improved position, and I think that deserves credit.
And the elections are coming up this year. What sort of leadership do you think Sri Lanka needs, keeping in mind the situation we have been through and the challenges we've faced so far?
For Sri Lanka to stay on this path, and a path that can give it strong growth in the future and see it return to being a middle-income country, ultimately, that will require quite a lot of ongoing transformation. And as difficult as the last few years have been, they will get far more difficult if Sri Lanka is unable to stay on the path that has got them to this point, and the reforms that have been difficult but sadly necessary, and they need to continue. Otherwise, I think Sri Lanka will really struggle to attract the investment, to support the jobs. And without a strong economy, you can't pay for hospitals and schools and other supports that Sri Lankans, I think, desperately need. So as difficult as the economic medicine has been, it is entirely necessary, regrettably, and I would encourage Sri Lankans to stay on that course, and those who are going to do that, I think, are making the right choices.
All right. Many countries, including Sri Lanka, have been impacted by economic challenges post-COVID. What is the situation now in terms of the economy in Australia post-COVID?
Well, right now we're undergoing a cost of living crisis. And post-pandemic, I mean, Australia came through the pandemic with one of the lowest death rates and best economic growth records of any country in the world. We were basically hailed by none less than the Munich Security Conference and others that highlighted Australia's sort of gold standard reaction to COVID. That doesn't mean it wasn't difficult. It was tremendously difficult, but we emerged strongly from it economically. But with that came an inflationary aftershock, and that's been obviously exacerbated by the expansionary fiscal policies that have continued. And those have been designed on defence spending, which is understandable, but curbing inflation and getting cost of living under control is placing a lot of pressure on Australians, and that's a very current issue as Australia indeed goes towards its own election next year.
And 2024 is an election year for many countries across the globe, and election results have been somewhat different this time around. For example, in the French elections, the left-wing alliance secured the most number of seats in the National Assembly. And then in Sri Lanka, there's a major increase in the support for leftist parties, something which has never been witnessed before in the history of the country. And in UK, the Labour Party wins the general election after
Sure.
14 years. What do you think has caused this clear shift?
Well, I don't think it's a political shift. I think it's a shift away from incumbents. That's what all of those who lost elections have in common. They were in government, and they were in government at a time when cost of living pressures were exasperating their populations, and the people were unhappy with the responses the government was putting in place. So it didn't matter whether they were left or right or centre. That people were unhappy with how things were going, and they decided to remove a government.
And they just wanted a change.
Sorry?
They just needed a change.
Well, they hope for one. I think that's true. Whether they get one or not, we'll see. But I think in each of those cases, what we saw was a vote against incumbents as opposed to a vote for someone else. And that's important. That's very important in understanding that difference. I wouldn't read too much into the ideology of the choices. It was more of a vote against those who are in power than a vote for those who are coming into it.
All right. What were bilateral relations between Sri Lanka and Australia like during your tenure as Prime Minister?
We gave great support during COVID, as you'd expect us to. We're a great friend of Sri Lanka, and Sri Lanka is a great friend of Australia. Our relationship with India, particularly as part of the Quad, and our trading relationship with them gives us a focus on this part of the world, and Sri Lanka is very relevant to that. In terms of direct engagement, there had been visits by the Prime Minister with my predecessor, and there was ongoing connection, but there certainly weren't any issues in the relationship, that's for sure. And a lot of great work was done by our High Commission here in supporting various programs. I think one of the most important programs that Australia can engage in to support Sri Lanka now is in the area of vocational education and training, and helping equip the workforce to be an export-orientated economy, to have the skills that Sri Lankans are going to need to be competitive in that environment as that you build your economy again.
And something I've heard about you is that you were a tough operator. And when you're a leader, I think sometimes you have to take tough decisions.
True.
And it's not always possible to satisfy everyone. Do you think your approach to certain policies has helped you in your political career?
Well, my approach was always designed to get the results on the policy that I was working on. If you're constantly guided by the politics, well, you can make some poor decisions. You've got to do what you think is in the best interest of the country. And sometimes those decisions are unpopular. Sometimes they can end up being to your political disadvantage. But when you're the Prime Minister of a country, you've got to do what's best for the country.
Indeed.
There are the things we did during COVID, which wasn't always popular, but they were necessary. And you have to exercise your responsibility in those roles.
You were praised for handling COVID exceptionally well, but then there were times when you were also criticized. I mean, how did you deal with criticism in your political journey of 17 years?
Well, I didn't think about it too much because, frankly, I was a bit busy.
That's a good one.
We were dealing with any number of crises when I was Prime Minister, and you always have your critics in public life. Those who aren't on the playing field, well, they've always got plenty of opinions. The Sri Lankan cricket team knows that as well as the Australian cricket team. If you're on the field, well, you're the ones who need to make the decisions and make the calls. But those who sit in the stands, well, they're just looking on.
All right. There are ongoing conflicts in the world, such as the Ukraine-Russia war. Do you think diplomacy and dialogue can help find solutions?
Well, you hope so, but they won't find them in a vacuum. What I mean by that is there has to be something to back this up. And so the situation in Ukraine is enormously frustrating. Russia seems intent to continue its invasion and seems prepared to waste as many lives as it possibly can in that pursuit. In response, we're doing enough to keep fighting, but it would seem not enough to win. And that produces a rather tragic stalemate. And so I think this is a very, very, very difficult issue. Obviously, taking an even more aggressive approach in response to Russia runs the risk of an even more catastrophic conflict. So these things are not easy. But I suppose what I think Ukraine highlights is the importance of having effective deterrence before these things happen. Because once a hot conflict starts, it's very hard to end. And it usually ends well. Even in victory, it comes at a great price. And so in the Indo-Pacific, the tensions that exist, particularly in relation to Taiwan and places like that, like-minded countries have to provide the deterrent to defer aggression. And that failed in Ukraine. But when you have effective deterrence, when you have effective countering of assertions being made, then the diplomacy can have effect, because it's happening in an environment where it is the better option to talk and sort something out than resort to conflict, which is clear because of the strength of deterrent, could end very badly for you.
All right. Let's revisit your tenure as Prime Minister. What were the decisive policies or decisions that you took, which you feel help shape the future of Australia in a positive light?
Well, look, I think in the international security space, it's very difficult to go past the AUKUS agreement, which wasn't just about an agreement between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States. This was a recognition of the need for like-minded countries to band together to make the Indo-Pacific a safer place. And that is the intent of all these types of security and defence agreements. They are not to actually be in a conflict, they're intended to avoid a conflict. And so I was a keen champion of those sort of relationships and alliances, like-minded partnerships on anything from trade to humanitarian support and assistance, what we did through the Quad, and trying to transform Australia's economy through an energy transition to deal with net zero. I was the first Prime Minister in Australia to commit Australia to net zero by 2050. Now, that wasn't a decision that was popular with many of my own political supporters, but I believed it was necessary to help Australia's economy to transition over time. And so understanding the security threats we were living with and working with allies and partners, whether they be the United States or Japan or India or Great Britain, or working closely with our more local partners, often smaller countries, whether that be across the ditch in New Zealand or our Pacific Island partners or up in Singapore or places like that. And I always saw Sri Lanka fitting into that pantheon of nations with whom we've always had very, very friendly relations, a shared history in many respects culturally in terms of the colonial heritage, which we both have, but from different perspectives. And as a result, I think Australia was able to play a positive role in connecting many countries that had similar outlooks on the world.
And when you look back on your political career, what is it that you find to be most fulfilling?
The decisions you made every day as Prime Minister, whether it was ensuring that people got access to affordable medicines in particular. I mean, the number of lives I saw changed because Australia, when we were in government, was able to run a strong budget, which meant we could fund medicines, we could fund Medicare, we could fund hospitals, we could fund mental health care in particular, which was a strong focus of mine. Our government had a strong conviction that unless you run a strong economy, you can't have a stronger welfare safety net. You can't have a stronger health system. You can't have a stronger education system. This is why I say when looking at where Sri Lanka is right now, you've got to get the economic fundamentals right first. Otherwise, as much as others will seek to be benevolent, there will not be the resource to do it. There will be empty hands and you need your hands full to be able to support those who need that assistance. And so that was both our economic record as well as our philosophy, that where we ensured the economy remained strong and we kept our budget under good management, then we could deliver the essential services that Australians rely on. And in the time we served in office, they were trying times. There wasn't just COVID, there was natural disasters, there was floods, there was fires, there was tornadoes, it was one of the most extraordinary period of natural disasters that Australia had faced in decades. And you add to that what we were dealing with in terms of China's assertions in the region and its coercion of Australia during that time and having to stand up to them. And it was a period of intense strain, but we came through it very well.
All right. And before we end the conversation, I wish I could have a longer conversation with you, but given the time restraints, what message would you like to give to all Sri Lankans watching this program now that you're here in Sri Lanka?
I'd simply say this. I think Sri Lankans are an incredibly resilient people. You've had to be. You've had to face so much. I was here just after the end of the war and had been here since then. There's the tsunami. There was the bombings. There was the economic crisis. And so I believe fundamentally in the resilience of Sri Lankans. You have strong family, community roots here and supports of each other. But I would say stay on the path to recovery. I know it's hard to stick with the reforms that have been effectively imposed on the country, but they are necessary reforms and they will take to a place where you can be more confident about your future. Do not walk away from them now, because I can assure you if you do, then what you've seen in the past will only be repeated, but there won't be the next set of chances that will follow. So I would urge Sri Lankans to stay focused to that path. Now, the political parties will make their pitch about how they're going to do that. I hope they would all commit to sticking to that path. And that would give, I think, countries and investors that are looking to support Sri Lanka a lot of confidence. Walking away from that, I think, would put Sri Lankans at great risk.
All right. Thank you very much for your time and for this conversation. It was indeed lovely having this conversation with you. And I wish you all the best.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for watching. I'll be back with another episode. Until then, stay safe and take care. And do remember to share the video, like, comment, and subscribe if you actually like my content. I'll be back with a new episode. Until then, stay safe.